Before we start the tour, I'll do a quick language check. We hebben Nederlandstaligen aan boord, alsjeblieft. Engels is oké? Oké, perfect. Gaan we wel snel nog in het Nederlands voorstellen natuurlijk. Welkom aan boord. Ik ben Brent, uw kapitein voor vandaag. En gelieve natuurlijk tijdens de rondvaart te blijven zitten en armen en benen aan boord te houden, maar voor jullie is dat redelijk gemakkelijk. Voor de veiligheid natuurlijk, dank jullie wel. Est-ce qu'il y a des gens à bord qui veulent le tour en français aussi? Pas des francophones? Then it will all be in English. Okay, welcome aboard everyone. All in one language. Lucky me. So welcome aboard. My name is Brent. I will be your captain for today, and I would like to remind everyone to please remain seated during the tour and to keep your arms and legs on board for safety reasons, of course. Thank you very much.
Ja, hallo zusammen, auch noch eine kurze Begrüßung von mir.
Ali, enkel in het Engels.
Brett wird die meiste Zeit natürlich sprechen, weil ich denke, die meisten Leute verstehen Englisch. Wir machen eine 40-minütige Bootsfahrt durch Gent. Wir sind in Gent, in Ostflandern, im niederländischsprachigen Teil Belgiens. Das da hinten ist übrigens die Burg.
So also welcome to Gent, of course, the third biggest city in Belgium, a population of about 280,000 people. This year we also have a bit more than 81,000 students in our city, so that's a bit more than a quarter of the entire city's population. This makes of Gent the largest student city in the Dutch-speaking world. Now, of course, the Dutch-speaking world, just a tiny part of the entire world, but we are still the biggest student city there. And on the right side here we have the Great Meat Hall of Gent. Until 1880, this was the only place in the entire city where people were allowed to buy or sell meat. This was done to ensure proper quality and price control. You can see they are working on renovations nowadays. Once they are finished with those, it will probably become a parking lot for bicycles. With all the students we have in the city, a lot of bicycles as well, so they can all put them in there. Across from the Great Meat Hall then, on our left side here, we have the old fish market. As the name implies, this is of course where people used to sell fish. And more specifically, they sold sea fish here because they thought it was of a better quality than river fish because of all the pollution in the rivers back then. And this is also something we can see from a local dish here in Gent, waterzooi, which kind of translates to watery mess. And this dish was originally made with fish from the local rivers, but in the first half of the 20th century, the rivers were so polluted that there wasn't a single fish to be found anymore. So they changed the recipe to have chicken in it instead. This is the version of waterzooi you'll most likely find nowadays, but if you find a place that still serves it with fish, then you know that this is the original recipe of waterzooi.
When you finish your fast, and I get you that one. You also get that in Eupen, in Carrefour.
Gent in the Middle Ages, of course, was a major trading hub in Europe. We traded mostly in textiles and cloth, but also in grain, and this all happened in the harbor just behind the bridge where we started the tour. That's the old grain harbor, and here we used to have the staple right on grain. That means that the city could take 25% off of every load of grain that arrived here. Most of the grain came from the north of France, the region of Artois, and transport between Artois and Gent was very easy because the two rivers in our city, the Skeld and the Lys, that is this one here, they both have their sources right over there. So the boats just had to follow the river until they reached Gent. And when they did reach Gent with their loads of grain, They deposited them in the grey building over there on the left side. That building is nowadays where Manhattan's Burgers is, but this is also the oldest grain storage room of the harbor from 1200. You might be able to see that the front of the building is leaning forward slightly. This was done on purpose to make it easier to pull bags of grain with a rope to the higher floors without those bags dragging against the front of the building the entire time, of course. But it was also an easy way to evade a bit of taxes, because there used to be a tax on the surface area of the ground floor. So if all the floors above it were just a bit bigger, they had more usable surface area and still did not have to pay any extra taxes. And a bit further also on the left side, on the front of the building over there, we can still read het korenmetershuis written on there, just above the windows on the right side. That means grain measurer's house, and here they would measure the grain by putting it in big copper barrels and going across the top of the plank to make it nice and smooth, and then they had a perfect measurement of how much grain there was in store. In between those two buildings there's a tiny house with blue windows, which is where the tax inspector used to live, and he was replaced every year to prevent bribery and corruption. If we look behind St. Michael's Bridge on the right side, we have St. Michael's Church, and they started construction of this church in the late 15th century, and it was largely financed by the Brewers Guild, and in that time they were one of the richest and most powerful guilds in the entire city. Of course, these brewers wanted to show off their power and wealth by building the highest tower in the entirety of Ghent. But in a few moments you can see that they did not really succeed with this plan, because the tower is a pretty modest height, and that's because in the 16th century Ghent was suffering from an economic crisis, so there was no more money to finish construction, which is why the tower is still at the same height it was in the 16th century. And in a few seconds on the left side we'll have a wonderful view on the three iconic towers of Ghent. Unlike St. Michael's Tower, all of these towers have been completely built, and the one furthest away from us belongs to St. Bavo's Cathedral. There you can still go and watch the paintings of the brothers Van Eyck, the Adoration of the Mystic Lamb. The tower in the middle then is the belfry and has a golden dragon on top, and that dragon is the protector of our city. The tower closest to us then belongs to St. Nicholas Church, and this church has once been used by Napoleon as a stable for his horses. Not a very religious man apparently. Underneath St. Michael's Bridge as well we can still see parts where the stones have chipped off. That's because of the bullets that were flying around in 1944 when Canadian soldiers came to liberate Ghent from occupation. It's a pretty loud microphone. The graffiti here in the alleyway on the left is also a reference to the Adoration of the Mystic Lamb. These paintings are nowadays the altarpiece of the cathedral, so they are bang in the middle of the building. But they used to hang in a side chapel of the building, and before starting work on their paintings, the brothers Van Eyck went into this chapel to see how the sunlight came through the windows, and they used the exact same lighting for all of the subjects on their paintings. So it looked very natural while hanging in this chapel. We can also see the golden dragon on the belfry appear again. This one has a pretty interesting history as well. It is said to have started out on a Viking ship around the 7th or 8th century, and from that Viking ship the dragon ended up in England, because that is of course where a lot of Vikings went during that time. From England it went all the way to the other side of Europe, to Constantinople, nowadays Istanbul of course. And eventually from Constantinople a Flemish merchant brought this dragon to Flanders, but he didn't bring it to Ghent. He went to Bruges first, And according to legends, in the 13th century, some people of Ghent went over to Bruges, stole their dragon and put it on their own belfry, so Bruges nowadays has no more protectors, sadly. On the right side here, this building is called Het Pand. From the 13th century on, this was a Dominican monastery. In the 16th century then, during the iconoclasms, that is of course the period in European history when Protestants and Catholics were not exactly getting along very well, the Protestants entered the library of this building, took all of the 30,000 books and manuscripts that were present there and threw them all in the River Lys here. And we can still read in a diary that was found from that time that people back then could walk from one side of the river to the other without even getting their feet wet. That's how many books were piled up underneath the water. But to be honest, the water is not extremely deep, so with less than 30,000 books they would have managed this as well. On average, the river in the center is about 1.5 meters, some places 2 meters deep. So you don't really need 30,000 books to fill that up, I think. And then once we're completely turned, we'll have St. Michael's Bridge in front of us again. And behind the bridge on the right side is the old post office. And these were both designed by architect Louis Cloquet and built for the World's Fair in 1913. Louis Cloquet also designed the St. Peter's railway station. And there is a clock tower just a bit further on the old post office that is very similar to the one from the station as well. On the old post office we can already see two little statues right underneath the roof of the building. There are 23 of those in total around the building, and they are all of the heads of state from that time who were all connected to the International Postal Union. And nowadays the building doesn't function as a post office anymore. That is of course why we call it the old post office. Now you can find some shops on the ground floor as well as a hotel in the higher floors, and there you can even book a room in one of the towers of the building. Needless to say, this is a pretty expensive room, of course. In the busiest seasons it can go for about 500 euros a night, and I'm also not even sure if breakfast is included in this price. And another extra thing about the statues underneath the roof, when I first started on this job, there was an audio guide that said one extra sentence about those statues, and that was that one of them was a statue of Florence Nightingale, and they gave no further explanation. So I was pretty confused why Florence Nightingale would be up there with all the heads of state from that time. But apparently I did some research, didn't really find anything, and then a colleague told me that it might not even be Florence Nightingale but the architect's wife. Louis Cloquet wanted to add a statue of his wife to the building. Very sweet, of course, but very confusing for us boat tour guides because apparently she just looks like Florence Nightingale. The building immediately behind the old post office with the caravel carved right above the door. That's a type of ship invented by the Portuguese, and it's also this type of ship that was used by Christopher Columbus. That building was the old guild hall of the free boatsmen. These free boatsmen were originally from Ghent. They were self-employed and had the monopoly on inland shipping, so they were the only ones allowed to transport cargo across the rivers in the center. And the existence of free boatsmen, of course, implies the existence of unfree boatsmen, and they had their guild hall on the left side. That's the beige building over there with the golden caravel on top of the roof. When these unfree boatsmen arrived in Ghent, they of course had to transfer all of their cargo to the boats of the free boatsmen because, as I just mentioned, they were the only ones allowed to transport this within the center itself. I also have an extra little story about the two golden swans on the Marriott Hotel over there on the left. You can see that they are facing away from each other, but normally swans in a symbol like this would have been facing towards each other because they were a symbol of eternal love. Here, however, the swans are facing away from each other because there used to be a brothel in this building, and apparently it's pretty difficult to find eternal love over there, so this is why they face the swans away from each other. And the name of our city comes from the Gauls. They were the people that lived here a bit more than 2,000 years ago. It was them that made it so difficult for Julius Caesar when they came to conquer the place. And these Gauls had their very first settlement at the confluence of the rivers Skeld and Lys. That is where these two rivers flow together. And they named their settlement Gandai, and this word also just meant the place where two rivers flow together. And a little bit of extra information, because I have time enough to tell you all the details. Julius Caesar, he wrote a text called De Bello Gallico about his campaigns in Gaul, with his wars there, and he wrote about the Belgians that they were the bravest of all the Gauls. Now this is something that a lot of Belgians will tell you with great pride, but what they usually forget to mention is that a little bit later in this same text, Caesar explains why he thinks the Belgians were the bravest of all the Gauls, and this is because the place we were living in was considered very hostile. The winters were so bad, it was constantly raining, it was very swampy. It wasn't a very nice place to live, he thought, and therefore he concluded that the only people who would be living here were the bravest of all the people in the area. You could also call it the stupidest of all the people in the area. It's just a matter of how you view things, of course. And I think we all know Manneken-Pis in Brussels, one of the most famous monuments of a little peeing boy, but he's definitely not the only one. We have one in Gent as well. We'll be able to see it just behind the next bridge, and I'll point it out to you once we pass by it. There is another one still in Gerardsbergen, that's a town in Flanders, and there used to be a lot more of these statues even. And this is because they were the mascots of the tanners guilds. And the tanners were the people who worked and softened leather. And for this they had to use urine back in the day. It is the ammonium in urine which causes leather to become soft, but apparently alcohol breaks down the ammonium content in people's urine. And because adults here in the Middle Ages drank more beer than water, because clean drinking water wasn't always easy to find, the tanners could not use adults' urine to soften leather. There was not enough ammonium in it, so they had to use children's urine because they did not have a drinking problem yet. And this is then why we had so many statues of peeing boys in Belgium. We can see him over there on the left side, on the front of the white building, with his two girlfriends on either side. Our Manneken-Pis is called Nestor, and his two girlfriends are Lena and Luna. And there is an extra little joke that the boat tour guides sometimes make, and I have time enough to tell you this joke as well now. At one point in time, the little boys found out that they could just add some water from the river to their bucket of urine to increase the volume, and thus how much they got paid as well. But this is of course bad for the quality of the leather. It wasn't becoming as soft anymore. So the tanners, they found this out eventually, and they had to start hiring people to test the quality of the urine by having a little taste. Sounds like an absolutely awful job, but apparently some people really did like this, and they eventually moved to the Netherlands to found Heineken Brewery. So just to clear up, this isn't exactly historically accurate, but it is a funny joke, and since we have time enough, I can tell you everything I know on the tour. So
that's true. When we went to the army, we also, when you got the new boots, everyone peed in them and left them overnight with the pee to soften the boots, otherwise you get blistered.
And also in a few moments, on the right side, just behind the last house next to the water here, we'll be able to see the backside of a massive red cannon. This cannon weighs more than 12 tons and is called Crazy Margaret, or the dulle griet in Dutch. This cannon has only been fired once in its entire existence. You can see it appearing here now. And this one shot has also just caused one casualty. And that was the man that lit the fuse of the cannon. The recoil of the shot slammed against his body so hard that he instantly broke his back. And then he got pushed into the river here, where he drowned. And then the cannonball very quietly rolled out of the barrel and fell to the floor half a meter further. So then they decided not to use this cannon anymore because it was a bit worse than they expected it to be. And that was then the only shot ever fired by it. A lot of people are watching cycling apparently. Today's the day of RYAW, one of the classics in cycling. I'm not a big cycling fan myself, I just know this because a friend of mine is absolutely obsessed with it, and by proxy I kind of have to be as well.
Das habe ich euch ja letzte Woche im Video erzählt.
Now we have
dass
just
Belgier
entered the old
absolut
industrial part
Radsportvolk
of the
sind.
city. All the buildings here on the right side, they all used to be textile factories or workers' houses. Ghent was also called the Manchester of the continent back in the day. This is because, like Manchester was for England, Ghent was then for the mainland of Europe, the very first industrialized city. And this is all thanks to Lieven Bouwens. He was a man who lived here around the time of the Industrial Revolution. And he apparently had his education in England, which gave him a very naturally sounding accent, so not even English people could tell that he wasn't from England. And with this skill set, he went to the factories around Lancashire to perform some industrial espionage. He told the factory bosses there that he was going to open up his own factory in Scotland and that he came by for some tips and tricks, but of course this story was completely false. He just used his time in their factories to steal parts of their machinery and smuggle all of these parts back to Ghent in bags of grain and sugar. And when he arrived here in Ghent, he could completely reassemble an entire machine. And this machine is called Spinning Jenny, and it's still up to view in the Industry Museum of Ghent nowadays. I don't know if we have any English people on board, but this is always a perfect opportunity for some friendly banter, saying that this is the best chance for the English to go visit a museum to watch something that was stolen from them instead of the other way around. And behind the buildings, right here in front of us, is the oldest still existing neighborhood of the city. This one is called Paters Hol, and this literally translates to Monk's Hole. That's because it was here that mostly the monks and the priests, so people of the clergy and also of the lower noble class, used to live. And these were the only people with enough money to be able to buy stone houses. Stone houses, of course, stand the test of time a little bit better than wooden houses, and this is then the reason why it's still the oldest existing neighborhood nowadays. In the street immediately behind the buildings, the Sleepstraat, that one is full of restaurants, so if you're looking for a nice place for dinner tonight, you just have to take a walk through that street and you'll definitely find something that you'll like over there. we look through the street on the right side between the buildings, we can see right onto the Wedle Square, Wedleplein, right in front of the castle. And in the middle of that square we can see a black lamppost with two lamps on top. And these are connected to all of the birth departments of every hospital in the city. And there's a button over there that parents can push to light up the lamps. So if you're ever on that square and you see that the lamps are shining, then you know a baby has just been born in our city. We will be leaving the River Lys soon and heading onto the canal over there on the right side, just behind the old fish market. This canal is called Lieve Canal and was dug in the 13th century. It used to go all the way to Damme near Bruges, although nowadays the canal stops at the edge of the city centre at RYAW. And that is of course where we're going to have to turn back as well. We will not be sailing to Bruges now, but I don't think that is such a big deal because we're already in Ghent anyway.
Krijgt dan toch een keer een voorrang, hè?
And in the beginning of the canal over there on the left side, we can see the wooden facade there with the yellow planks. That's the only remaining wooden facade of Ghent nowadays. It dates from the 16th century, and after this time it became illegal to build any new wooden buildings in the city because the risk of fire was becoming a bit too much, of course. And as you can see, this is also a great example for the tax evasion on the tax for the surface area of the ground floor. They won quite a bit of surface area in this building, I think. And just behind the next bridge on the right side, we're going to have a wonderful view on the castle of the Counts of Flanders. So if you want, you can get your cameras out already.
Castle. Yeah.
What's the name of the castle?
The Castle van Gent. Grafenburg or something. Grafenschloss.
That's the castle.
So the castle of the Counts of Flanders, or Gravensteen, was built in 1180 for Philip van Elzas, and he was back then the Count of Flanders, of course.
Grafenstein.
This castle was also the residence of these counts, And it is a bit unusual to have such high nobility living in a city centre so close to all the commoners. But this was done because the merchants of Ghent during that time were becoming just a bit too rich and powerful for these counts, so they stayed in the centre to keep an eye out on the merchants to make sure their power wasn't growing too much. My personal favorite story of the entire tour is about the very first time that this castle got conquered. But as they say, you keep the best for last. So I'll be telling you all about this once we pass by again in a few minutes. It's a perfect story to finish our tour. But in the meantime, I can tell you something that I recently found out about this little room that we see on the top wall over there. It comes out of the wall a little bit and has a hole in the bottom of that room. I think this makes it pretty clear that we are dealing with a toilet here. This is how they designed toilets in castles in the Middle Ages, and apparently this was a popular way for assassins in the Middle Ages to murder one of their noble targets. They would be hanging on the wall just underneath this toilet, waiting for their targets to go and take a poop, and once the target was there, he would grab a spear that he brought along and shove it in that hole, killing the noble targets. This wasn't a very common cause of death, but it happened more times than you'd like to imagine. Once told a piece of local folklore about these trees on the left side here, the weeping willows. A colleague once told me that if a couple were to kiss underneath one of those trees, that their relationship would last forever. But for the sake of honesty, I think that I should also mention that I know that this same colleague has tried this multiple times already, so I am not entirely sure if the story is 100% accurate, of course. Never hurts to try, I'd say. And then after having stayed in the castle of the Counts for some time, the Counts of Flanders wanted a bit of a more luxurious residence, and this is why they built the Court of Princes on the left side of this canal, though it is sadly no longer visible nowadays, as it's been almost completely torn down in the industrial age to make room for more factories. There was, however, a very luxurious palace with more than 300 rooms. There was even an open fireplace in every room, and it was in this palace that Emperor Charles V was born in 1500. He was in the 16th century emperor of both the Holy Roman Empire as well as of the Spanish Empire, and this made him the most powerful person in Europe in that time. And in the Court of Princes they also had one of Europe's very first zoos. There was a botanical garden here, but of course they did not just keep plants there. It wouldn't be a very interesting zoo. They also added 3 lions there to spice things up a bit, and these lions were called Ganda, Flandria and Belgica, and this stands of course for Ghent, Flanders and Belgium. As I said, the Court of Princes had been almost completely torn down, so that means at least one part of it must still be standing. And we can see that on the left side there are already 2 towers appearing there, and they are on top of an entrance gate. And this entrance gate is the only remaining part of the Court of Princes nowadays.
Okay. You're on that glass. Can you pick it up? It's okay, I'll give you one.
What is that?
The kaput.
Schon was?
I made it kaput.
Wir kriegen das wieder rein, ich guck mal nach. Ja.
Up ahead we can see the end of the canal, and that means the building standing there must be Rabot, and this is a fortified waterlock which we've once used to get rid of the army of Maximilian of Austria. He was besieging Ghent at the end of the 15th century, and he had his soldiers set up camp in the fields behind this waterlock, and then we opened the floodgates and flooded all those fields. And of course in that time flooded areas were places where a lot of illnesses could get started, so a lot of his army died of cholera and various other illnesses, so they had to pack up their bags and go back to Austria. And ever since that moment there hasn't been a single army to ever try and conquer Ghent from this side anymore. We can also see the hole in the waterlock is really small, especially for waterlocks nowadays. But this was a very primitive waterlock, of course. There weren't very big boats that had to pass through, and the mechanism that was in place was very primitive. It was just a wooden board that was slotted in between the 2 pieces of the canal, and when a boat had to pass through they just removed this wooden board so that they could quickly pull the boat through. And this is also why the hole was so small. They wanted to minimize the amount of water lost when they pulled away the board, of course. in Dutch, or noose wearers in English. A noose, just to be clear, that's the piece of rope they used to hang people, of course. And we earned this nickname in the 16th century. There had been a bit of a revolt in the city, and merchants had decided to stop paying their taxes altogether. So of course the Emperor Charles V had to come by here with a small army. He came from Spain, and he even got permission from the King of France to traverse his lands with an army, which was normally considered a very hostile action. But since it was about taxes, this was no problem for the King of France. So the Emperor arrived here in Ghent to punish those merchants, and he did this by shaving all of their heads, putting them in their underwear, and putting a noose around every merchant's neck. And like this, they had to parade around the entire city as a form of humiliation before they arrived back here at the Court of Princes, where they had to beg the Emperor for forgiveness and of course still pay the taxes that they owed him. And this is why they still call the people of Ghent noose wearers nowadays. Now we can see a statue over there on the right side of a man with a completely shaven head in his underwear and with a noose around his neck. That's one of the merchants, and this statue is of course referring to this nickname. Also still nowadays sometimes see people walking around in the city with a noose around their neck. This is mostly when there's been a football match of the team of Ghent, or during the Gentse Feesten, translates to Parties of Ghent. This is a city festival that we have every year at the end of July for 10 days. And this is one of the biggest festivals of its kind in Europe. I believe Oktoberfest is only one of the biggest festivals, or one of the bigger ones, and they have 5 million people every year over the course of 3 weeks. And with our 10 days, our last edition, we managed to attract 1.7 million visitors to the city here. Very busy period. They even have to divert the trams and buses to go around the city center because they just cannot make it through these 1.7 million people, of course. And it's always a little bit funny to see tourists arriving in Ghent during this time when they have absolutely no idea a festival like this exists. So they weren't expecting to see almost 2 million people. So if you do not like big crowds, avoid Ghent at the end of July. If you do not mind big crowds and like a big party, then Ghent is the place to be during that time, of course.
Wir sind uns am Rückweg. Oh, guck mal, ja.
I don't know if we have any desperate people on board, or if you know any desperate people. If you do, you can send them all to the building on the left side here. This is the Augustine's Monastery, and thousands of people still come here every year to pray to Saint Rita. That's the patron saint of the desperate people. So should you know anyone, you can send them all over here.
Warte.
my favorite story of the tour about the very first time this castle got conquered. And this happened surprisingly recently still, because this was 1949. And it wasn't conquered by an army, but by the students of Ghent. They were protesting, and it was a very Belgian protest indeed, because it was against the increase of the price of beer, going from 3 Belgian francs to 4 Belgian francs, which is a bit less than 10 euro cents nowadays. This is of course really expensive for a student, and this is why they decided to conquer the castle by dividing themselves in small groups of about 5 people each, and then over the course of an hour or so, all separately entering the castle as not to arouse any suspicion. When the final group was on the inside, they barricaded all the doors and kidnapped everyone else that was still in there. So obviously the police had to come by to try and arrest these students, because kidnapping was also still illegal at that time. And when the last group was then, they barricaded the doors, kidnapped all of the people, and the police came here. But I think we all know that castles are built to be really easily defended, so the police had absolutely no way of entering. And then the students were waiting on top of the walls to welcome the officers with volleys of eggs and tomatoes. So then the police had to call for backup from the fire department, who could use their long ladders to scale the walls of the castle, so it looked like a medieval siege. But again, it was 1949, and after this they arrested the students. However, these students did receive amnesty, because everybody in the city could agree that this protest was pretty funny. Sadly though, no real results were achieved with the protest, because as you might have noticed already, the price of beer nowadays is a lot more expensive than 10 euro cents. So I really do believe we could use a new protest sometime soon. So we are now approaching the end of the tour. I would like to thank you all for your attention. I hope you had a nice time on board, and I would like to wish you all a very nice day in Ghent still. Thank you very much.
Und ich verabschiede mich auch, und es geht gleich noch weiter mit weiteren Videos aus Belgien und später den Niederlanden.